This is a guy who used to belong to a genocidal terrorist organization telling Shia, we have no quarrel with you. I'm joking with my friends who studied this. I'm like, you got MAGA guys in the West who are like, we just gave Syria over to Al-Qaeda. Wait till they find out what DEI jihad looks like. I mean, he's far more progressive than a lot of elements we have here, at least in terms of the rhetoric. He has reinvented himself, or trying to reinvent himself, as somebody who can be let alone. He doesn't want foreign intervention destroying what he's doing, much like the Taliban. He's looking to kind of model it on a slightly softer version of their authoritarian rule.
All right, we are back with Michael Weiss, editor of The Insider, a Russia-focused independent media outlet. He's also the host of the Foreign Office podcast. Long time no talk, brother.
Was it like 3 days ago?
Yeah, it feels like it. I don't know. It was last week, I think, that we had you on. And in the ensuing couple of days, we had the Assad regime be toppled by the Turkish-backed rebels, HTS. And Assad is now in Moscow, presumably preparing for his new role, shoveling snow at the Kremlin. It was a remarkably fast defeat, though I think things were on this trajectory when we last spoke. But I'm wondering, what you think are the implications of all this, and maybe we'll just kind of tick through the geopolitical ones, and we'll sort of tick through them one at a time.
Well, the first set of implications, I think, the most important, which is before we get into what happens now or how it's going to change the landscape of the region, is for the first time in 50 years, quite a lot of people are able to breathe easily. Yeah, I mean, I've been watching over the past 72 hours. Horrific footage from Sednaya prison, which was this kind of, not even a prison doesn't describe it. I mean, it's a sort of a complex of dungeons within dungeons in the Damascus outskirts, where all of the political prisoners of this regime, some going back decades, Hafez al-Assad was still president when they went in, have been, in a sense, just sort of abandoned by the world, buried alive in some cases. Women detainees who had been raped by prison guards and given birth, having to live with their children in these squalid cells. I mean, it's Third Reich stuff. And I think we need to appreciate that. In the West, we had a moment perhaps with the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, and then a little bit with the invasion of Iraq in 2003, of celebrating, the blossoming of democracy and all that. We got a little too high on our own supply, and a little too eager and happy. But it has to be said. I mean, this was a brutal totalitarian dictatorship that, destroyed the lives, destroyed the families of so many people, including those who were not necessarily political, looking for the overthrow of the Assad dynasty, but simply, wanted a little bit of liberalization or the ability to say what they wanted to say. So just on that point, I think let's just give the Syrians their due here. They're celebrating for a reason. In terms of how all this went down, the last time we spoke, Aleppo had fallen. I kind of explained the dynamics of how that transpired. I think I might have used the phrase catastrophic success. So just as a small recap, every country in the region was normalizing with Assad, right?
Yeah.
A month ago, he ain't going anywhere. He's won the war. He's the king of Damascus. And even the United States under the Biden administration, although now they're trying to change their tune about this, they were sort of facilitating normalization and rapprochement, watering down the Caesar sanctions bill, trying to kill the anti-normalization bill, allowing all kinds of weird diplomatic overtures with the Emiratis, who have emerged as his sort of dead enders and his great defenders, even though at one point they were very much opposed to him. It looked like he was sitting pretty. There was one problem, one holdout in this scenario, which was rapprochement with Turkey. And the Turks were saying, look, we'll do a deal with you. We'll recognize your government. We want refugees, 3 million plus of them, to return to Syria, but we want them to return safely. Don't put them to the sword, throw them in Sednaya. And also, our big issue is with the Kurds, right? I won't bore your readers with the history of how the Assad family has used the PKK, which is the Kurdish militia, still technically a designated terrorist organization by the US and the EU. They used them as leverage with their relations with Ankara for decades. But suffice to say, when ISIS came into Syria and the US intervened, we propped up the PKK and created for them a protectorate slash statelet right on Turkey's southern border, pissing off the Turks like no other, right? Turkey wants the Kurdish issue solved, and they're going to do it in a military fashion. And they saw the writing on the wall. Donald Trump is elected. He wants out of the region. Syria is a place of what? Blood and death and sand, I think he once called it. Not enough oil to interest him. The idea that the conventional wisdom is he's simply going to hand off America's responsibility in Syria to the Turks. So they were kind of rubbing their hands with glee, and they couldn't get to yes with Assad. So HTS, I wouldn't call them Turkish backed. They're Turkish enabled, Turkish protected, Turkish empowered. But Turkey has its own janissary. Did I use that word?
Yeah, we're back to the janissaries. Yeah, okay.
Right. HTS has been begging Erdogan, put us in, coach. Let us have at it. The regime is bombing us. The Russians are bombing us. You're not getting what you want with Assad. Let us sort of put military pressure on him. And the Turks said, sure, go for it. They told them no in October. November, they said yes. And the idea was a limited offensive that would creep up into the Aleppo outskirts and then stop. And then suddenly let's restart the negotiations. Well, it's like they put their finger through a husk and the husk just simply collapsed into dust, right? I mean, there was no regime. The Syrian army melted away. There's footage of guys, or at least photographs of the aftermath of guys who took off their army uniforms, put down their guns, and melted back into society, right? And HTS said, well, let's keep going. And they took Aleppo. And they took Aleppo almost without shots being fired. And suddenly, I think the Turks realized, oh, okay, I mean, maybe we can get what we want now through regime change, and very easily so. And they didn't rein HTS in, if they could have at that point, I don't know. And now all of a sudden, Assad is toppled in Damascus. And here's the important thing. This was not a military fight for Damascus. Damascus was abandoned. It was ceded to the opposition in lieu of a pitched battle, which is absolutely extraordinary. If you were watching this take place in real time over the last 13 days, it was like, ooh, okay, they took Aleppo pretty easily, but now the battle for Hama commences. There was fighting, but not such a battle for Hama. Oh, okay, they got Hama, but they'll never get Homs so easily. That's going to be the real Stalingrad. I woke up and Homs had fallen. I was asleep. And then all of a sudden they're in Damascus, and it's not just HTS here. The actual first elements that reached Damascus, funnily enough, the Southern Front, which was a consortium of reconciled rebel groups. Russia did the reconciling, but so the idea was you put down your arms and we'll let you kind of run your little autonomous zones. But really, you know who the new master is. It's Assad, it's Hezbollah, it's Iran. These guys never liked the regime, and they were obviously, now we know, lying in wait all the time to take up arms again and press the fight forward. A lot of these rebel groups in the south, like near the Jordanian border, are former assets of the CIA and Jordanian intelligence. So they're known to the West. They reached Damascus first. Anyway, it's not just HTS here. I keep trying to get a credible number of how many fighters does HTS have. And the number I keep getting from Western stakeholders is probably between 60 and 80,000. 60 and 80,000 is not enough to hold all of free Syria. Yeah, right. They're going to have to do deals. There's going to be bargaining. And in fact, there already is. I mean, local administrations popping up in these liberated cities, other rebel groups that are, they're with it for the revolution, but at some point, maybe they're not going to be so amenable to Jolani's new governance or leadership. So it's so early days. I can't make any predictions as to what may happen. I just follow the reporting. And so far, the reporting is okay, cautiously optimistic, happy for the Syrian people, but deeply, deeply terrified that Syria becomes ungoverned space or a new safe haven for, I don't think people in the West are concerned necessarily about jihadism in Syria. They're concerned about transnational jihadism. The rise of ISIS again, Al-Qaeda, other new groups that might feel empowered who want to not keep it within the borders, but start exporting terrorism abroad. And Jolani so far, And again, you don't have to be a babe in the wood, and you have to trust this guy. And there's plenty about him not to trust. I mean, he's a deeply Machiavellian figure, but he's a shrewd politician as well. So far, he's being pragmatic. He's cutting deals with the Russians, so say the Russians, to allow their forces safe passage out. It may well end up being the case that the Russians don't have to abandon their naval base in Tartus or their air base in Latakia because HTS has reached some kind of accommodation with them. He did outreach to the Iraqi government. Don't send your forces in. We have no quarrel with you, even though they're the Shia. And he comes from an organization pre-Al-Qaeda. He was a member of what was known as the Islamic State of Iraq, which soon became the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. This is a guy who used to belong to a genocidal terrorist organization telling Shia, we have no quarrel with you. We want to build a pluralistic, multi-ethnic. I'm joking with my friends who study this. I'm like, you got MAGA guys in the West who are like, we just gave Syria over to Al-Qaeda. Wait till they find out what DEI jihad looks like. I mean, this guy he's far more progressive than a lot of elements we have here, at least in terms of the rhetoric. So he has reinvented himself, or trying to reinvent himself, as somebody who can be let alone. He doesn't want foreign intervention destroying what he's doing, much like the Taliban. He's looking to kind of model it on a slightly softer version of their authoritarian.
Yeah. So that's kind of my question. I was hoping you were to come on and give the 13 keys for Jelani to maintain power within Syria, Lichtman style. But if you're not willing to do that, make predictions. I am just on this scale from I guess what is the range? Is the scale this could end up anything kind of like Turkey, where it's sort of an Erdogan model, all the way to this could be like the Taliban in Afghanistan, or what is the what are the comps? What people are thinking might be possibilities?
Turkey is going to have a huge say in this. They've been dealing with HTS for 7-8 years. I mean, their corner of Idlib, where they started to really ply their trade in terms of governance and state building and, everything from enforcing traffic rules to COVID relief plans to all of this stuff. I mean, that was done at the pleasure of the Turks. There's Turkish garrisons in Idlib protecting them with artillery. All of the cross-border commerce was through Turkey, money, aid, So they have leverage here. They have skin in the game. And I think the United States is now, there's a New York Times article, the Biden administration is doing an assessment on who and what is HTS and what is their relationship with Turkey. If it turns out that the Turkish relationship is even profounder than we thought in terms of intelligence coordination and infiltration, then the West has some skin in the game here, because they will use Turkey as their kind of intermediary with HTS. People are starting to talk about delisting HTS. The Brits are kind of mulling it over. If they're the de facto government, we don't want Syria to become a failed state. We don't want them sanctioned up the wazoo. We're going to have to deal with them in some way. Early days yet. Early days. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. But the bottom line is America still has, 800-900 soldiers in eastern Syria. The Syrian Democratic Forces have also bitten off more than they can chew because the regime and the Russians pulled out. Just yesterday, the U.S. was able to bomb ISIS camps in Badia, in areas that had been governed above by Russian air power and below by this hollow SAA force, the Assad regime. And suddenly ISIS is getting their clock cleaned in the east. So, it's not as bad as it may seem, because, there are players on the ground, including American allies, that will have eyes and ears, and they'll have some influence and leverage now. Yeah.
The other question that I had, just listening to your kind of description of the husk that collapsed, and is that the big reason why it collapsed, right? Is what you just said, like the Russian backing, right? Like the Russian and Iranians have been weakened based on what's happening in other theaters, and they didn't have the interest, I guess, in intervening. I mean, wouldn't that have been the way for Assad to hold power? He would have needed them to intervene, one over the other.
I mean, there are two moments that I would love to have been, more than two, but in recent years, two moments I'd love to have been a fly on the wall as Putin was getting his briefings. The first is when the Russians invaded Ukraine, and Kyiv did not fall in 3 days, but they ended up getting booted out of Kyiv, and then a lightning counteroffensive in Kharkiv, and then Kherson. where's the Russian intelligence assessment of the Ukrainian fighting capability? Similarly, now, who's the guy who had to tell Putin that Assad and his army melted away, didn't put up a fight, melted away, and in the space of not even 2 weeks, it all just fell apart and crumbled, such that Putin said, "Screw it, I'm not coming to the rescue this time around." And the Iranians too. What a busted flush this guy is, all the blood and treasure invested by one regional power, one nuclear armed hyperstate in Europe, now invading its next door neighbor over the course of a decade, more than a decade. And the guy simply just collapsed. And he didn't put up a last fight. He just boarded a plane and flew to Russia. I mean, he and Yanukovych can do a kind of new version of The Odd Couple, can stream it on Netflix. I mean, two asshole
Send him to Siberia.
Yeah. I mean, so if you're the Russians and the Iranians, there might even be a creeping sense of relief. Like, finally, we don't have to prop up this, this paper tiger, the human toothbrush, as Christopher Hitchens used to call him.
I want to be a fly on the wall when Assad has to go have dinner with Putin, one of those long tables.
Well, and here's what's interesting, and this is also, checker? I mean, I exactly. The questions I have are the speed with which the Russians just pulled out, not from, as again, the sort of their perches in the coast, but all of the other forward operating bases, air bases that they had occupied. That suggests to me perhaps not just exasperation with Assad, but more of a vulnerability, weakness on the Russian side than we have yet fathomed, right? I mean, possibly because of the attrition that they're suffering in Ukraine. I mean, even Donald Trump tweeted the other day that Russia has suffered more than 600,000 fatalities/casualties, which tracks more or less with what the Brits had put out publicly. And remember, Trump is now getting intelligence briefings. So is he basically declassifying through X as is his wont? Yeah. I don't know, but the Russians are weaker than they were. Iran is, I mean, I don't know. It's like that scene in Rocky when, Apollo is like completely exhausted and just everybody's covered in blood and they're still kind of, I mean, Iran has nothing left here. Yeah. Like Hezbollah was completely decimated. Shura Council wiped out, their arsenal wiped out, if they even had the arsenal that they were said to have had, 150,000 rockets. What's left to save here? The Iranians are already talking to HTS. The Russians are talking to HTS. Right. The Syrian revolutionary flag is now flying over the Syrian embassy in Moscow. What a humiliation. The Russians allowed that to happen. I mean, there's going to be all kinds of brokerage.
We're adding a star. Is that the Syrian revolutionary flag?
The independence flag. It's actually more of a historical flag than it's the pre-Ba'athist one. But anyway, I think that a lot of people are beginning to reckon or strike these new accommodations with dawning realities. Yeah. That they pushed too far, they projected too much power, and now is the time for retrenchment, which is interesting. And also it poses, dangerously so, but nonetheless an opportunity for the West here. Not to do too much itself, but to start negotiating with different players to further weaken Iran's presence in the region. And, frankly, if this culminates with Russia getting kicked out of the Eastern Mediterranean, that's going to put a damper on a lot of things, including their ability to intervene in Africa, because Khamenei Air Base is what they use for resupplies and so on to go from Europe to Africa. Otherwise, the supply routes are too circuitous. So, yeah, I mean, our enemies have kind of, They took a bloody nose, and the new guy, the new sheriff in town, he's saying he doesn't want to have a quarrel with us. Well, I've seen that movie before, yeah. But it
can't be any worse than Assad, right? I guess we've been down that path before. I guess you never know. It could always be worse.
Something can always be worse than what came before. Yeah. It's just I really want people to appreciate that the depth of depravity and cruelty that this regime has inflicted, not just on its own people, but keep in mind, and this is what gets me about somebody like Tulsi Gabbard. I can at least appreciate, I don't agree or necessarily respect, but I understand a sort of Kissingerian realpolitik. Well, he's an awful dictator, but we have to do business with him because the alternative is worse, or we have bigger fish to fry and we need him, right? Whatever. I've heard that before. that's just IR theory 101. She goes to Damascus. She meets with this guy. He's not our enemy. Excuse me. He spent years importing foreign jihadists, including people who ended up joining Al-Qaeda in Iraq, sending them into Iraq to blow up American and British and coalition forces, as well as Iraqi troops, as well as Iraqi civilians. There's a great piece in The Guardian about how the Iraqi intelligence service, there were actually good actors in the Iraqi intelligence service, anatomized an operation plotted in Zabadani in Syria that consisted of Al-Qaeda operatives and the Syrian Ba'ath Party to basically import explosives into Iraq and blow up the health ministry and Iraqi government institutions, killing hundreds of people. This is Assad. Okay, when he presents himself as secular, as the protector of minorities, no, that's propaganda and bullshit designed to persuade gullible actors in the West who are terrified of what may come if he's not in power anymore. But I see Christians celebrating his demise. Who'd have thunk it? To listen to J.D. Vance, they're going to be put to the sword immediately. Yeah. So things are a little more complicated than they seem here, And again, you have to take it day by day, and let's not project our own fantasies onto a part of the world that is hard enough to understand how it got to be the way it is, much less where it's going from here.
Yeah. All right. Last thing, you spoke powerfully at the beginning about just these prisons. It's horrible, and you're right. Like you could use the word depravity, and just the depths of depravity of Assad. It's like the most horrific regime in the world, probably. Over
one of, for sure. Yes. For sure, one of.
So one of those prisoners is American, Austin Tice. President Biden spoke briefly about believing that he might still be alive. He was a freelance journalist and a veteran that was kidnapped, over a decade ago now. Do you have any sense for that or any other potential American interests?
I don't. I know Austin. When I was covering Syria in 2011, might have been the beginning of 2012, he and I connected over Twitter. I was actually leaving southern Turkey, and he had just arrived. And my fixer became his fixer. So he got into Syria, and then he and I were staying in touch. He was doing incredible reporting for McClatchy. And because of his military background, his reporting was even more powerful because he understood sort of the dynamics with air power and all the rest of it, things that are foreign to me, or at least at the time were foreign to me. And I never believed that he was captured by jihadis. There was a video put out, that showing him being taken up a hill, but the guys in the video for jihadis, it looked like they had their clothes freshly pressed at the dry cleaner. It was all very staged and artificial, right? And then lo and behold, it turned out the regime had captured him. Look, I hope to God this guy is alive. He's a great journalist. He's a friend. He's been through hell. I don't know the state in which anyone's going to find him at this point, because you've seen some of the detainees, the prisoners, the hostages, really, of Sednaya. One was a medical student taken 13 years ago who has complete, total amnesia, it seems. He's memory loss of everything. I have no, honestly, if I knew where he was, I would be talking to you about it.
I just thought, there's buzz, there's discussions and I'm sure rumors, et cetera. I just was wondering.
No, for sure. And, but again, you have this country that is honeycombed with torture facilities, dungeons, places to keep human beings alive, such as it is. And I think everybody's now trying to scramble to figure out where these facilities, where these sort of pockets are. So, it's too soon to tell. But I have no doubt if he's been kept by the regime, then he will be found.
Michael Weiss, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Much happening, much happening. And as we have a transition into the next administration, I think that we will have much to discuss about foreign policy in the new year as well. So thanks for coming back on so quickly, and we'll be talking to you again soon.
Okay, my pleasure.
All right, thanks to Michael Weiss. Everybody else, we'll be back here tomorrow with another edition of the Bulwark Podcast. See y'all then. Peace.